Greetings, film friends, friends of the film. Hope you all are staying cool out there. Uh, Thanks for being flexible this week. Uh, I'm just really glad that climate change doesn't exist, um, and we can enjoy this nice, balmy weather together. So, despite the weather's best attempts to stop us, um, we're going to plug ahead with our discussion of environmental health in film. As you all no doubt know at this point, we are starting off with our assessment of the environmental health themes in WALL-E. So the first issue we're looking at is the concept of sustainability. And sustainability is a kind of a broad term that can be defined in a few different ways. I like these definitions. It is a complex issue that includes environmental health, issues of social equity, economics, and when these things are working together, the goal is to have a healthy, thriving, resilient community, not only now, but into the future. Sustainability is complicated. There are a lot of issues working together. That's the term systems approach uh, is a reference to this concept that it's not just one thing that affects sustainability. It's a lot of different factors working together um, to to create a sustainable or non-sustainable thing. So, put a little more simply, sustainability presumes that resources are finite. We don't have, for example, unlimited forests on the planet. Um, Sustainable forest or timber extraction, for example, would be maybe you cut down um, 10 trees in the forest, but you also replant a tree for each one you cut down. So you get those 10 trees now, and then in the future, someone else can extract 10 trees from the same forest. Uh, Something like that is a simple example of a sustainable practice. It acknowledges that the forest doesn't go on forever. That if you cut down all the trees, um, you get a lot of timber, you get a lot of product and money and whatnot. But in the future, if someone wanted to extract trees from this forest, there would be none left. That's an unsustainable practice. So sustainability inherently refers to what's happening now and long term into the future. Um, it's about us, it's about our children, and it's about our grandchildren. Uh, Sustainability suggests that we can live healthy lives and that practice can continue. If we live unsustainably, we might be well off because we are getting all the benefit of extracting the resources, but there's going to be less and less over time. We've learned about this in previous classes. Just to refresh your memory, the Anthropocene is the period of time we are living in now. It essentially means the age of man. The planet has been impacted by humans to such an extent that really there's no place left on Earth that hasn't in some ways been influenced by human activity. So, a bunch of scientists and smart people came together and wanted to attempt to guide or evaluate, how sustainable or unsustainable um, we are, and what those consequences might be. So we've also learned about this concept of planetary boundaries that basically gives us a framework for how to live sustainably. Um, it divides the Earth into these broad categories like climate change, um, novel entities like microplastics, stuff like this. Um, Basically, you can also kind of think of this as like a bank account and a budget, right? You have so much money, and let's say that each month you need to devote a certain amount to maybe groceries, um, another amount to gasoline. In this case, it's climate change and novel entities. Um, if you if you spend uh, within your means, uh, you're spending sustainably. Um, it means that you're not spending all your money on one thing, so that next month, for example, you have none left uh, to buy food or gas. Um, when you begin to overdraw from the bank, you enter into these yellow and red areas, suggesting that you're overspending or over consuming. Um, and so this is a scientific way of looking at the concept of sustainability on the planet. And the reason this is important in our discussion now is because you are tasked with assessing sustainability in WALL-E. Well, how do you create variables to assess that? Do you create a variable that is like sustainability? Yes or no? Well, how would you score that? What does that even mean? You need to create variables that represent sustainability in some way. How do you do that? Look to the global health science of the issue. And this is one example of that. So the concept that we have these finite resources on the planet, we need to budget for our use of them. And if we don't budget, if we are unsustainable, bad things can happen. So we know that climate change is the thing. Um, we are doing this lecture online right now because of record heat waves. Record heat waves are a product of a changing climate. Um, and so forth. Um, Land use, for example, there is only so much land on the planet. For example, we have only so much forest, only so many grasslands. Um, if we convert every forest to farmland to grow French fries or potato, that would be cool if we could grow French fries directly. But to grow potatoes to turn into French fries, um, we can harvest a ton of French fries up front, but then there is nothing left for the future. Um, so if we overconsume the land, we are pushing beyond this planetary boundary, and the more and more we consume, the further and further into the red we get. So as you can see, the global assessment now is that we're kind of pushing our luck. We are over consuming, and the trend is kind of going in the wrong direction. We need to rein it in and try to keep ourselves within this kind of safe space. So think about the science of this theme that we're looking at and how you might use these different concepts to create variables to help you assess sustainability. Uh, Biodiversity loss is a big one as well. So the number of different plants and animals on the planet. We know that we are experiencing a massive extinction event. A lot of animals and plants are going extinct. They are finite resources, and once they're extinct, they're gone. Um, you can think about this then into the future. What would a future look like if we continued unsustainable practices in this area? Well, there would be like no plants and animals left. Do you think this was depicted in Wall-E? Novel entities, again, things created by humans that we really don't know what they will do long term. Things like microplastics. Um, we are not really sure the long term consequences because they're so new. Um, Plastic is a big issue because it doesn't ever go away, it just breaks down into smaller and smaller bits. So just because you throw away a water bottle, come back in 500 years and it's gone, the water bottle didn't vanish, it just got broken down into smaller and smaller pieces that you can't see anymore. A lot of this finds its way to the ocean, which gets absorbed into marine life, food webs, and ultimately into humans. So, this concept of kind of staying within our budget for these different areas, um, how can we try to understand what this might look like in the future? How might this impact us into the future? Um, we have learned in the past about this group called the IPCC. It's a group of researchers and scientists and stuff from governments from around the world, all coming together to study this. Their consensus is that the climate is changing. It's changing in an unsustainable way. We are emitting greenhouse gases from driving our cars and factories and stuff. Uh, they put together this kind of approach that allows us to understand what might happen in the future um, given different scenarios. So the best case is RCP 2.6, where we, you know, start all driving electric cars, go totally carbon neutral, um, put a pause on all deforestation activities, really kind of clean up our act. Um, that's kind of best case scenario. Then we have three others that are increasing all the way up to 8.5, which is the worst case scenario, meaning not only do we try to clean up our act, but we actually are accelerating our consumption and our emission of greenhouse gases. And using these different future scenarios, we can model what this is going to look like in the future. So, for example, in the best case scenario, RCP 2.6, in the next 100 years or so, here's what the planet's increase in temperature or average temperature might look like. You can see that some areas will be less warm. Some areas like the Arctic are warming more. Um, in the worst case scenario, if we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you see more of the planet is, turning into high temperature areas. Um, Same is true for like precipitation. Um, in the worst case scenarios, we see that some areas will experience a lot of rainfall, way too much rainfall, leading to flooding and all kinds of other problems. Other areas, like in North America, will experience less rainfall, leading to droughts. Um, and we can try to understand, what are consequences of um, either sustainable or unsustainable consumption patterns, what they might look like in the future. So again, if we are over consuming, if we are pushing beyond planetary boundaries, that would be an example of RCP 8.5. If we stay in our lane, if we stay within our budget and within our means, if we stay within mostly the planetary boundaries, the RCP 2.6 is most likely what's going to happen. So, one concept to also understand when trying to evaluate this theme is the concept of tipping points. So the goal right now is for the world to try to not get 2 degrees warmer than before the Industrial Revolution, before we started, driving around in cars and factories and stuff like that. We want to try to keep the amount of warming under 2 degrees globally. Because if we go past that, we are going beyond our planetary boundary budget, and we are entering into a kind of area of uncertainty. And the reason we picked 2 degrees is because it's considered a tipping point. A tipping point, again, basically refers to the fact that if you increase, let's say, CO2, and you're looking at how that responds to increases in temperature. So for every 1% increase in CO2, you get a 1% increase in temperature, and that's kind of a predictable upward trajectory. That is probably not the case. The concept of tipping points suggests that there might be an increase, a steady increase, but past a certain point, a tipping point like 2 degrees, things might rapidly change. So once you get past this point, things really start to go into change mode. So did WALL-E, the WALL-E world, depict a world past the tipping point? The more we increase our temperatures, the more large scale changes are expected to occur, like sea level rise. If the planet goes to 2 degrees warmer, Florida is looking a lot different in the future. If we go even warmer, Florida looks even more different. And you can see this parallel in WALL-E. The world depicted in WALL-E looks much different than it does today. Is this realistic? Is this based on the kind of science of sustainability? Well, based on the modeling here, we can see that yes, if these changes continue unsustainably, the world will look like a different place. There is precedent for this. It's thought that, for example, the community in Easter Island experienced a similar kind of tipping point event. Everybody knows these famous Easter Island heads. They probably also realize that the civilization that made them no longer around. So what happened to them? One theory is that they basically succumbed to unsustainable living. They had to provide for their growing population, so they cut down all the trees. This ultimately led to a food collapse and food shortage, and eventually the society collapsed. This theory is kind of disputed, but I included a link that gives you a little introduction into the Easter Island hypothesis. The point is, the extent to which you live sustainably or unsustainably can create a world that looks very different. And at some point, the world becomes so different that humans can no longer live or live well. And this is kind of happening in real life. We are beginning to plan for such an event. Companies like Elon Musk rocket company SpaceX, for example, is planning to build colonies on Mars to create human civilizations on the planet, so that if we completely destroy the Earth, we'll have a fallback option. Kind of reminds me of what's happening in WALL-E. These large rockets that are being built to transport people to Mars are actually being built as we speak. And I know this because I visited them this summer. And I can now say that I have booped a Mars rocket launch tower, Boca Chica, Texas. So when evaluating WALL-E and sustainability, a few questions you might ask. For example, uh, are the negative health effects of unsustainable development portrayed in the film? Uh, if so, how? If this is the question you're asking, how might you create variables to help you answer this? And you can see that there are different ways of looking at sustainability with these different questions. There's not a right or wrong. Uh, you can have more appropriate questions or less appropriate, but you need to try to specify what exactly you're looking at when you're researching sustainability in WALL-E. Obesity is the other issue that we're looking at. Obesity, similarly, is a growing problem, pun intended, I guess. It's predicted that the number of obese people on the planet expected to continue to increase. This is true globally, some countries more than others. So the burden of obesity related deaths, um, you can see happens to more or less extent in different countries. Um, it is also worth noting that obesity is a significant global contributor to global mortality. And if you look at the risk factors globally that put people at risk for death, um, a lot of these can be lumped under the sustainability or sustainable consumption concept. Um, so when you're trying to figure out, well, what variables do I put together? Like, how do I do this coding thing? How do I assess sustainability or obesity in WALL-E? Um, break these concepts down into the science, what we know about them. We know some of the risk factors associated with sustainability or unsustainability and obesity. We know that obesity has many factors or causes. Um, this is an example of systems thinking where we don't just have one thing contributing to obesity, it's a combination of different things working together. Uh, generally, there are the things that uh, are more or less out of our control that contribute to obesity, biological influences like genetics, for example. And then there are things outside of us that are a little more modifiable, called modifiable risk factors, that also influence obesity. For example, environmental influences, uh, social influences, economic influences. Does poverty prevent you from accessing good food? Do you live in a food desert because of economic circumstances? This is something kind of outside of you that can impact obesity. And so, if you have a situation where you're living in a food desert, in a neighborhood with no option for exercise or green space, and you combine that with genetics that make you more or less susceptible to um, obesity, you can see that how these factors begin to come together. Um, another way of looking at this is each of these can be turned into a variable. So, does WALL-E depict the parental influences of obesity? Does it depict genetics? Does it depict the environmental factors that create obesity or are associated with obesity, economics, etc.? Um, each of these can be turned into a variable that you can use to quantify the film. So again, obesity is complex, many factors. That means you can make many different variables to assess this concept. We know that the environment can influence obesity. So this suggests that sustainability and obesity are overlapped and that one goes with the other. How does the film depict that? Um, we are consuming now more than ever in an unsustainable way. Uh, and one of the outcomes is that we're consuming to such an extent that it affects obesity. And in the film, it shows that all future humans are morbidly obese, and it's suggested that this is a result of overconsumption that also contributed to a dead Earth. So again, you want to develop these kind of research questions. There is no one right or wrong research question. How do you want to assess obesity? For example, do you want to explore the links between sustainability and obesity in the film? This helps you narrow down the list of variables that you might want to create. For example, let's say I want to create a trash variable to help me better understand the depiction of sustainable practices in the film. I can create a trash variable that looks different depending on how I want to go about this. I can create a categorical trash variable where I create these categories based on how many times I observe trash in a given scene. I can create a trash variable that is just like a yes or no. Is trash present in the scene? Yes or no. I can create like a Likert scale. So, on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how would I score the amount of trash? Um, Once I've come up with my variables and put together my coding system, I can take this to a data set. For example, I can add my variables as columns, and each row is a different scene. I might put a timestamp on when the event happened or when the scene happened. And if I'm doing a binary variable for trash, and let's say scene 1, I don't observe any trash, I give it a no. The second scene, I do observe trash, that would be a yes. If I went with the Likert scale, scene 1 has no trash, so it's a 0. And let's say scene 5 has mountains and mountains of trash, tons of trash, trash everywhere, score it a 5 or a high. You can also see how this is subjective and a little tricky because if you watch the film and score it a 5, would someone else watch the film and maybe score it a 4? Because their perception is a little different. That's kind of the tricky part of doing this kind of research. So there's no one right or wrong way of collecting your data. This is one way of doing it. You can also flip it. So each column is a different scene. And maybe you want to organize your variables based on the broad themes that you're looking at. So for example, I take my Likert scale trash variable and apply it. So scene 1, I score a 0 because there's no trash. Scene 2, I score a 5, etc. And I can do the same for all my variables. So then what do I do once I've filled up my spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers? I've quantified the film. Next, you want to start digesting and getting results. So when I say create a figure or a table, this is what I mean. You can turn your data into stuff like this. Don't look at this as accurate results of the film. These are just examples. But one example could be I wanted to look at trash or garbage, and does it come from robots or humans? So that's the variable I want, and I code it as either a robot or a human, maybe a 1 or a 2. And I count the number of times that I observe trash that is caused by robots and trash caused by humans, and I can graph that. And my result here is that humans cause trash more than robots in the film. So this suggests that humans are more to blame, and you can go on to discuss kind of what this means. Does this kind of match up with the science of what we know? What are the kind of global health implications? You can turn your analysis into tables. Again, not one right or wrong. What best helps you answer the question? For example, the depiction of livability on Earth. How do we suggest that Earth is now a livable place again? So we might count up the number of times that we observe plants in the film, or we might count up the number of times we see living creatures like the little cockroach. Um, which one is depicted more? Well, with a little table like this, it's simple to kind of break it down and to answer that question. So that brings us to our film journal. And if you look at the assignment, what we're doing now, the content analysis of WALL-E, you're going to want to put together and write up. That's part one. So put together a brief summary of your methods. That is the 4 variables that you developed and including how you coded them. You'll want 2 for sustainability and 2 that help you explore obesity. Then you're going to want to summarize your findings. So analyze your data, put together either a table and or a figure, and give me a brief write-up. Not how you think it should be depicted, but how were these issues, based on your analysis, how were these issues depicted in the film? The second part of the assignment is going to be a little more independent on your end. So we've kind of walked through WALL-E and introduction to content analysis. Now you guys apply it to the next film, Erin Brockovich, which is another film that looks at environmental health issues. And in particular, it looks at pollution. So for this film, I'm not going to give you the research question. You're going to want to develop one. This is going to ultimately guide how you analyze the film, what kind of variables you create. To answer your question, you want to create 3 variables and the coding system that you've come up with. So again, how have you coded your variables? Write that up and summarize it in a little method section. Being detailed enough to where if you handed this to another student, they would be able to recreate your results and know what you did. Then review your data, summarize your results, including at least 1 table or figure. And then in a little more in-depth discussion, talk about how, based on your analysis, the film depicts this global health issue and how it relates to similar events that have happened. For example, the Love Canal case study, the Flint Water case study. Both of these, I've included some summary reading on the website. So how does the film kind of portray pollution, and how does that relate to real life instances? But it's also worth noting that Erin Brockovich is based on a true story. In the film, Julia Roberts plays the lead character. In real life, there is an Erin Brockovich who has become an advocate and a fighter for holding corporations responsible for pollution. So in between now and next week, when we meet again on Tuesday, you are conducting a content analysis of Erin Brockovich. The film is available on a lot of different platforms, either for streaming or you can rent. For example, on Amazon Prime, it's $3 to rent. So you're going to want to do your background research on the issue. In this case, it's environmental pollution. I suggest reading through one or both of the case studies, Love Canal or Flint Water, to try to understand what variables you might want to put together. Create your variables, figure out how you want to code them, and then conduct a content analysis of Erin Brockovich, examining the issue of environmental pollution. And we'll talk about it next week. So in between now and then, I will be holding some kind of class office hours on Thursday. We're not meeting as a group. This is time for you to watch the film. But if you'd like to meet to go over any of this, I'll send out a calendar invite link, and we will unpack this all next week. So stay cool. Try not to melt. The heat wave end in sight, hopefully. Just again, really glad that climate change isn't real, so that we won't have to worry about this anymore in the future. That was sarcasm. All right, over and out.